All right. Um, so this is my week 3 assignment. So we first start with scenario 1. Um, Answering a few questions that the owner might have for me. So what is Windows authentication in SQL Server, and one benefit to Windows authentication over secure authentication? So Windows authentication is default authentication mode and is more secure than SQL Server authentication. It's also referred to as integrated security, which is tightly integrated with Windows. So users who are already authenticated with Windows need not provide any additional credentials when connecting to SQL Server. So the user account is confirmed by the Windows, so which makes it more secure than SQL Server. So the next question, the difference between authentication and authorization. I think it's pretty simple. Authentication is just the process of verifying who the user is, whereas authorization determines what resources a user can access. An example is I have Joel as a user, so it can authenticate first by connecting to a SQL Server instance. Then the database will give him access to sale order, and the schema will give him access to only Office. And the user, Joel is not allowed to look at any other database than sales. So what will happen if grant select permission on the table to fix row called public? It means that any user will be allowed to read the table. So would this granted permission apply to future users? Yes, everyone belongs to the public database role. So is this dangerous? Yes, it is. Because granting fixed role to user-defined roles gives access to those that should not have access to it. So the best thing to do is to set all user permissions and assign roles before giving SQL login. I think that is pretty much for scenario 1. So we move on to the second scenario, in which you created some few schemas and users. So to create 2 new schema for the bowling and school, which is what I chose, which is the schema that I chose. You just need to run create schema, and you create 2 new schemas, member and game, and the bowling league example. Then I did the same thing in the school scheduling example. Schema. And instructor schema and the school database. Now transferring out all database schema into created schema. So to do that, usually I need to select the database in which you want to work and alter the schema. So using alter schema, and decide to alter the member schema and transfer all database owner to this new schema created. So you can see here, these DDOs were transferred using the transfer command to transfer them into the alter schema. And I did the same thing with game schema, transferring these DDOs. And again with school, using the same alter schema transfer to transfer the DDOs to this. So you can see the result of it is where am I? Bowling school. You can see here we have the game that appeared after running the query. So I did the same thing with school scheduling, And um, you can see it here in tables. You have costs, which are which is the schema that are created, and instructor is also the schema that are created. So now creating 4 new logins, 2 for bowling and 2 for school, and give select rights, 1 user, 1 schema per user. Okay, so I created 2 users in a bowling league example using create login, and with password, which gives a password to it and pass as a password. The default database that you want to use is bowling league example, and check expiration is turn off, and policy also turn off. The same applies to bowler 2, which is another user. And I created school 1 and school 2 users in login, and the school scheduling example with pass as password. So to map the schema, we needed to create a user for the login. So to do that, we need to map it. So create user bowler 1 for login bowler 1, and then you alter the user and assign it to members. So granted select to the schema to the user as well. So the permission to select was given to bowler 1. So the same thing applies to bowler 2, and I create another login. Another user was created for login school 1 and the school scheduling example database. So basically that's what was done for the 2 logins. Created users for the login, then you alter it. So when you run it and when you execute it and you go to security and users, you can see the login school 1 and school 2. The same applies to bowling. The same applies to bowling example. Users. We have bowler 1 and bowler 2. So in the school scheduling, you have the users here, school 1 and school 2. Okay. All right. So scenario 3, which we do we needed to determine common level authorization for the new users that were created. So to work on the DCL grant, I chose a recipe database for DCL and created login recipe 1 and created a user for the login recipe 1 underscore 1 as the user for the login. Then granted insert to the ingredients database. So recipe can insert, and the ingredient, can select ingredient, can delete ingredient. That is pretty much what recipe can do. Yeah, in the recipe example database. So recipe was given a rule of data reader in the recipe example, and ingredient denied it, which means you can't do it, and you'll be denied insert. So which means that insert will be revoked whenever you try to insert anything in the database. Yeah. So, and then I created two new logins and users and add rows to it in the recipe example. So create a login recipe one with pass as password and recipe three. So anytime you create a login, you need to also create a user to the login for the login. So the user recipe two and user recipe three, and they were assigned data reader, yeah, as role, okay, in a database. So they can only read, they can't do anything. So to see that, uh, let's connect to recipe one. So I have recipe one here in the password. So when you connect, you can see the database. Uh, when it tries, when recipe1 try to access the bowling league example, uh, the database will deny access to it because it has no right to that database. And that is what we are doing now. So to the recipe example, he has access to it, can read anything that is in the recipe example database. Okay. So the last scenario, we needed to show evidence of that we created on the login, the users, the role were all working perfectly. So when you run the query, you run it. So when you run the query, you can see the Ebola 1, Ebola 2 users that were created. And school 1 and 2 and recipe 1 and 2. Yeah. So all the logins are there and the schema and this. Okay. So we have course. Yeah. So all the schemas are there and the users in the row are all there. Yeah. So basically that is all about the assignment. So you can see everything is working. We have all the users and the logins and the schemas all showing in the database. Okay. So, yeah. So that is pretty much all that we needed to do. Let me run this again. So you have course instructors. Those are the schemas that were created. And here we have we have the game schema that was created. Okay. So you can see everything is working. is working perfectly. So yeah, so that is it. That is all about the assignment, and thank you. See you next time.